And welcome. We are in Junior English, and our challenge for the hour now is to work with a text by Washington Irving. I'm with you on page 226, 227. The title of this text is The Devil and Tom Walker. Now, right away, we want to first of all make sure that when we say text, we are going to point out that this is a piece of short fiction. So we want to write that down, sometimes referred to as a short story. A work of short fiction or a short story. All right? Now we want to make a few general observations about this text and about the author of this text, Washington Irving. There your dates are on 227. Notice 1783 to 1859. Okay? So there's some important kind of timeline for yourself. Think about that. Tom Jefferson and his pals write that famous essay, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness." In 1776, look at your dates here when he's born. 1776 is when the Declaration of Independence is written. 1783, just a few years later, is when Washington Irving is born. He will live in a time, very important for your notes, when America is beginning to become an economic power. I'd write this down. He will live in a time when America is beginning to experience economic growth. You have people who are starting to make quite a bit of money, and the culture is already changing, increasingly becoming more capitalistic in its thinking, wanting money. Now, let's just point out, and it's with you there on 227, Irving is known for a couple of really famous stories. You may have heard of these stories even though you didn't know it was this guy. Notice there in the last paragraph, traveling in Europe from 1815 to 1832, Irving encountered European folklore that helped inspire his own writing. Two of his best-known works, there they are. You've probably heard of them. The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, I think, has actually been made into several different times film. Yes, right, okay. So maybe you've heard of that one with the Headless Horseman and all of those kinds of stories. That's this. And then the other one is Rip Van Winkle. If you've not heard of that one, you might write that one down. By the way, I just gave you two titles to write down where? At level what? 3A, right? So I just gave you two titles to write down at level 3A. That's pretty easy. As we are filling out our annotation, that's a simple one, isn't it? Okay. Obviously, once we finish with the titles, with the text, we can come to other ones. Now at 2B, before we begin, you're looking at the literary analysis information on 226. Now what I want to do real quickly is I just want to remind you of your freshman year of high school. So stay with me for just a moment. I want to remind you that anytime we work with a piece of short fiction, we have this thing called plot. So let's write that down. I'm working at 2B. Plot. A plot is simply the map of the story. All right? In other words, the sequence of events as they occur is what we mean by plot. Now, if you remember, back to your freshman year, there was this comment about how often plot looks something like this. Do you remember this? Do you remember this? I hope that you remember this. Good, good. So here we go. Plot follows what is often referred to as this plot hill. So let's write this down. The events of the story have a natural progression from beginning to middle to end. The beginning is often referred to as the exposition, or the beginning, okay? Where we're going to introduce at least three things. We're going to introduce time. When does the story take place? We're going to introduce place or setting, right? Right? Like, in other words, who is actually, where is the story set? Is it set in America? Is it set somewhere else, etc.? Okay? And then finally, we're going to have some issues of characterization. Okay? Characterization. That is to say, who's in the story. Okay? So we're going to have characters that will be introduced. Now, anytime we're working at level 1 with a story, in the early part of the story exposition, we want to answer these three questions. Right? For example, in our story, who is Tom Walker? Okay? It will be called the devil in Tom Walker. So as we get into our story, we're obviously going to want to make sure we know who that is. Okay? Where does the story take place? What time does the story take place? Those are going to be important questions for us in the exposition. We then, secondly, in the story for plot, have what's called the rising action. And you can kind of see why this was put on a little hill, right? Rising action. Where the primary thing that happens in this rising action is the introduction of the conflict. Write this down, this is important. The conflict. The struggle, the fight, the conflict. Okay? Now we have two kinds of conflict in stories. Alright? We have internal conflict and we have external conflict. Okay? Internal conflict, external conflict, or struggle. The internal conflict is a character as represented by the letter C. A character versus self. Okay? That's what we mean by internal conflict. Should I do this? Should I not do this? Thinking in the mind of the individual character. Okay? So anytime in a story that we have a character thinking, struggling with himself or herself, that we call internal conflict. Okay? External conflict is going to be of three primary kinds. You can have a character versus or against another character. Maybe the most classic example of this from your freshman year of reading was The Most Dangerous Game. For those of you that remember this story, it's a story about a guy that ends up on an island where he is hunted by another man. Character versus character. Okay? A second kind of external conflict is character versus nature. These are the stories where a character is out snowmobiling on the Bighorn Mountains and he wrecks his snow machine and the snow blizzard comes in and he has to try to survive against the elements of nature. Character versus nature. Okay? The third is what we will call character versus society or the group, or sometimes even referred to as an idea. Okay? Alright? So in the rising action, this conflict is introduced. Good stories, I'd write this down, good stories often can have more than one conflict that can be understood, depending on which one you focus on. When we finish, for example, with this story, The Devil and Tom Walker, we will want to ask, in your estimation, what is the primary conflict? A, is it internal or external? B, if it's external, which is it? Character versus character? Character versus society? Character versus nature? Look at the title of the story. What is it? The Devil and Tom Walker. Which immediately, without even knowing the story, seems to suggest what kind of conflict? Right. Character versus character. Right? As in the devil is one character, Tom Walker is another character. But as we finish the story, we're going to ask ourselves this question. What really is the primary conflict of this story? And how is it resolved? The word resolved takes us to our next phase in plot. Somewhere after rising action occurs, we have what we'll refer to as the climax of the story. Now the climax, when we were kids, we often thought of as the most exciting point in the story. Right? He puts his hand out to get ready to turn the knob, to open the door. That we often think of as the climax. But as academics, we will say, no, it's not always, the climax is not always the most exciting point in the story, but rather we're going to concentrate on the conflict coming to its fruition. That's an easy way to think about climax. In other words, there comes a moment in the story when because of the conflict or the struggle, something has to give. That we'll call the climax. Depending then on which conflict you're focusing on, the climax can be different. Do you understand what I just said? Depending upon which conflict you focus on, what you consider to be the climax of the story might actually be different. When we finish this story, I'm going to ask you, what do you consider to be the climax of the story? And why? Finally, on the other side, and you can understand why we sometimes call this the plot hill, we have this, what we will call falling action. The French word is the denouement, the tying together, the bringing it all together. This is often referred to as resolution as well, right? And depending on the kind of story, you can have the moral to the story is, if you're talking about those famous Aesop fable stories, right? Okay. These resolutions can be of different kinds depending on the story. Are you familiar with the ways in which movies often end so that there will be an additional movie to follow? See how that works, right? Okay. Sometimes the resolution will not be a clean one, but make you wonder if there's going to be more coming. Now again, this plot map, okay, is one way for us to look at short stories. And in fact, if you look at page 226 real quickly, notice under literary analysis, are you looking at it with me on 226? Under literary analysis, they're going to ask you to focus on characterization of or related to the exposition on the whiteboard, right? In other words, who are the primary characters? Notice you're going to have direct characterization, indirect characterization. Direct, they're going to tell you exactly what a character is like. Indirect, though, is more like you're going to discover what the character is like through the study of the story itself. Let's now turn to the story itself. The Devil and Tom Walker. The first thing we would want to point out, and you'll always want to do this kind of scanning as you read, is to go ahead and just flip through the book real quickly and see the number of pages of this story. Go ahead, I challenge you to do it now, because you don't want to be surprised when all of a sudden you hit page 4 and you still have more pages to read of the story. Did you hear what I said? So right away, for some of us as readers, we're going to immediately be somewhat intimidated by this story and go, seriously? This is a really long story? Why do I have to read so many words? So right away, we're going to challenge ourselves to stay focused and to read this story, are you ready for this, in small chunks, where we're going to ask ourselves as we read about Plot Hill. Does that make sense? At the very beginning of the story, we'll try and answer 3 questions. Right? What is the place? Setting. What is the time? Who are the characters? Primary characters. As the rising action begins to occur, we're going to focus on the conflict of the story. What is the struggle in the story? What is the central challenge of the story? I'm going to help you out here. Finally, there will be the question of climax. What is for you the moment when the conflict comes to some kind of fruition? This reading this way can help you to be able to actually gain some insights at level 2A, messages, themes. Okay? Now I want to go real quickly to the background information on 229. Read it with me now. The story that you're about to read appeared in 1824. I'd write that down. I'd write that down in my annotations. This is a story from 1824. Okay? When, keep reading with me, the American economy was booming. I would definitely write that down. This is a story that's published when America and its economy is beginning to grow. Are you ready for this? People are starting to get really wealthy in 1824. You have a lot of really wealthy Americans, okay? So the story is going to be popular during that time. Keep reading with me. Advances in technology, transportation, rapid growth of cities created large markets for goods. For the first time, manufactured items were widely available and people had money to buy them. I would call it this, I'm working in metaphor, but you'll understand what I'm saying. 1824, we have the beginning of the concept of Walmart. We have the beginning of the concept of malls. We have the idea that you can mass distribute large amounts of goods and people with money get to buy all that stuff. Okay? 1824. The second thing we want to point out from this is that Irving's story retells the European tale of Faust. F-A-U-S-T. I would write that title down at 3A. There's your third title, by the way. If you've already written down the 2 others, Sleepy Hollow and Rip Van Winkle, from our earlier information, I've now given you your third title, The Story of Faust, by the famous German writer Goethe. G-O-E-T-H-E. G-O-E-T-H-E. Faust. F-A-U-S-T. Faust is a famous story. You might want to write this down at 3A. Faust is a famous story about a guy who sells his soul to the devil. If you have ever seen any show where in the show the devil has a conversation with someone and makes a bargain with them, and if that other someone loses, the devil gets the soul, that is the story of Faust, who is a famous scholar and the devil comes to visit him. Mephistopheles is the name of the devil in Faust, and comes to him and says, I'll give you something, whatever you want, but for it, you've got to give me your soul. Now, this idea, by 1824, is a well-known idea. So Irving is actually playing with a very ancient idea at this point, where the devil and a human being are going to make an exchange. You got me? Jot down at 3A really quickly, what is your favorite movie where the devil has to make an exchange with somebody for their soul? Do you have one of these that you're familiar with? Most students will say, I watched a movie in the last year where something like that happened. Okay? Keep reading with me. Faust, of course, the scholar who sold his soul for wisdom. Tom Walker, Washington's Irving's American Faust, has no interest in wisdom. He's simply after riches, right? Stuff, right? He wants money. Irving may have said his story in an earlier America, but he revealed the materialism of his own era. I would write down the word materialism. What is materialism? The desire for more stuff. Now, before we begin our story, it does beg a really interesting question at 3B. So I'll ask you. If you could have one wish fulfilled, if you had the ability to have one thing you requested given to you, what would you request? You get one. And as they often say, no wishing for more wishes, right? We know that joke. If you could have one thing given to you, a desire of yours, what would that desire be? And can you write it down real quickly? Question. Would the desire be for something you can touch or you can get, like money or stuff? Or would your desire be something different? A student once said out loud, I would desire for a happy family, not the crappy family I gotta live in. See, that's not really like money, is it? Some students would say, I would desire to be smarter, or I would desire to have athleticism. Right? Okay. In our story, Tom Walker is given a choice. The choice he makes determines his life. I will say that again. You want to write it down at 2A. This is one of the major messages of this story. The choice he makes determines his whole life. Here's the thing about choices. We often don't know if they're going to be important ones or not for our future. Would you agree with me? Right now, even though you haven't even lived 20 years, you can look back over your life and say, 1 or 2 times in my life I made a choice. I didn't know at the time how important it was going to be. It almost seemed silly or insignificant, right? The same is true in our story. A choice is made. Whew. How does it affect Tom Walker? Now we're going to listen to a reading of the story. As we read, starting on page 229, pay attention to the exposition. Where are we? Place. What time are we in? And, of course, who are the major characters of our story? I'll give you a hint. 2 of them, the devil and Tom Walker. That is the name of the story, isn't it? Right, okay? So already Washington Irving is a bit setting us up for this. Now, this story will challenge our focus. Again, let's pay attention and read along. Don't just listen to the story being read. Read along with the story. I challenge you to try and follow with your pen or pencil top lid, to try and follow along with the story and see how well you do. The Devil and Tom Walker, here we go.
The Devil and Tom Walker by Washington Irving. A few miles from Boston in Massachusetts, there is a deep inlet, winding several miles into the interior of the country from Charles Bay, and terminating in a thickly wooded swamp or morass. On one side of this inlet is a beautiful dark grove. On the opposite side, the land rises abruptly from the water's edge into a high ridge, on which grow a few scattered oaks of great age and immense size. Under one of these gigantic trees, according to old stories, There was a great amount of treasure buried by Kidd the pirate. The inlet allowed a facility to bring the money in a boat secretly and at night to the very foot of the hill. The elevation of the place permitted a good lookout to be kept that no one was at hand, while the remarkable trees formed good landmarks by which the place might easily be found again. The old stories add, moreover, that the devil presided at the hiding of the money and took it under his guardianship. But this, it is well known, he always does with buried treasure, particularly when it has been ill-gotten. Be that as it may, Kidd never returned to recover his wealth, being shortly after seized at Boston, sent out to England, and there hanged for a pirate. About the year 1727, just at the time that earthquakes were prevalent in New England and shook many tall sinners down upon their knees, there lived near this place a meager, miserly fellow of the name of Tom Walker. He had a wife as miserly as himself. They were so miserly that they even conspired to cheat each other. Whatever the woman could lay hands on, she hid away. A hen could not cackle, but she was on the alert to secure the new-laid egg. Her husband was continually prying about to detect her secret hoards, and many and fierce were the conflicts that took place about what ought to have been common property. They lived in a forlorn-looking house that...
All right, so notice we're already being introduced to some characters, aren't we? Namely, Tom Walker and his wife. What does this term miserly mean? Let's give it a different word. Write it in your notes. Greedy. Greedy. In other words, selfish, not wanting to share. Even Tom Walker and